Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about Baudrillard on the negative. I think that this is a really interesting conversation because in the context of space privatization, there are a lot of really interesting ways that I can see Baudrillard being used against a whole host of affirmatives, whether they be policy or critical. And throughout the series, we've been able to really touch on the ways in which Baudrillard is kind of critiquing various central functions of the resolution, whether it be from the affirmative or the negative. And I want to continue to kind of like finish out this series by us being able to have a conversation about what Baudrillard particularly looks like in the context of how it is able to respond to various types of criticisms that are read on the affirmative, and the way in which it can be used as a negative strategy versus various affirmatives. If you haven't, I would go back and watch the last video that I did that kind of starts off with some of the conversation about what this strategy looks like. It lays out what I think are some of the base priorities that you need to kind of like situate in terms of like being flexible for reading this criticism and have a variety of options for how you execute it. And then I went on to talk a little bit about what it looks like in terms of the framing portion of the debate and the thesis portion of the debate, and hopefully those are really good context for you to be able to have a really good top level understanding of what the criticism is supposed to compose of, because in this video I want to be able to kind of move into a lot more specific conversation when we begin to talk about things like the link debate, permutation debating, impact comparison, alternative debating, all of which I think are really important facets of how you really make this criticism work versus K teams, and how you're able to really gain offense against a lot of the different alternative visions for futurity, and the ways that we relate to just the development over space as a whole that a lot of these critical teams are developing. And I think that having a really nuanced like postmodern strategy to engage in can really ask some interesting critical questions about like the crux of what their solvency is attempting to accomplish and why it's necessarily different from the status quo. I think at a link level, there are so many interesting arguments to make about like why the kind of agents that are open for critical teams mimic the same ideals as privatized space cooperation, but at the level of like a different source. I think that it would be really interesting to make analogies between the way in which like Elon Musk basically operationalize himself as like a prime example of what space privatization looks like. And I think that you need to make examples about why the ways in which like Elon Musk is basically able to use like whiteness and capitalism as its own kind of identity policy to justify like his own desire for an ascension to space is the same way that various types of other criticisms are able to like make arguments about the way in which they kind of like frame the idea of being able to ascend to space as a kind of reparative for like various sources of historical violence. I obviously think that there's an argument to be made in the context of the moral differences between those examples, but I feel like in the context of the way in which you're thinking about the basis for the resolution, there are really good arguments to make about why these criticisms move closer to the concept of privatization than they do to something that is much more like public. And I don't even think that you need to be defending that the idea that the public is good, but rather that the idea that we're able to think about space through any of these terms, or that there is a kind of like dichotomy between the two, and that the affirmative is able to place itself on kind of the moral high ground of such a dichotomy, means that you're able to make arguments about like why they're actually like folding themselves back into the same type of like form that is kind of the crux of why the resolution exists as it is, and also is what not necessarily opens us up for context of privatization, because the interests that are able to cross over and be able to kind of like make it so that various types of space exploration ultimately end up in like various other privatized sources that are just in the name of something morally better, ultimately allows for the convergence of these various futuristic dreams with the kind of like needs and desire for being able to create and positive notions of science and technology that come from capitalism, privatized sources, etc. And I think that all of these things kind of forward a really interesting set of ways for you to be able to package link argument that's like really important for you to be able to like have a flexibility in terms of your ability to get outside of what are like some more traditional ways of being able to think about thinking about like what the kind of role of link arguments is and how you're able to separate it for some of the thesis concerns that we laid out in the last video. I then think that when you move on to questions like the permutation, a lot of it is how you're able to form mutual exclusivity from the mode of the alternative. I feel like for this type of criticism, a lot of the routes that you really want to go is not to have a competing vision of the future, unless it's really a vision that's able to envision like the process of like the various types of critical projects failing, which I think is a little bit harder to defend at like a material level, because I think that it makes the debate messier in terms of how those future visions turn into material action. But I do think there are a lot of arguments to make about like why thinking about the way that we position ourselves politically from like a position of like failure and rethinking our arguments to like technological and scientific failure could be really good arguments about like how we're able to break the kind of like positivist form that we're able to think about the terms that the resolution is able to take up. And I also think that on the other end, you can make a lot of arguments about refusal, all of which allow you to make like much more mutually exclusive arguments that make the permutation like kind of like a non-option for a lot of these teams. It makes it a lot easier for you to kind of win, that it's just a question of being able to win whether the affirmative should be sent back to the drawing board or not, and not a question of whether you're able to win, there has to be some kind of like notion of the world where everyone is able to access a unionized version of like being able to like look into and reach into space. I think making arguments about like why the kind of like permutation isn't able to reconcile the ways in which the 1AC kind of like sees the failure of these projects is the way that the alternative actually sees the failure of these projects is necessary is a like really crucial part of your ability to kind of like make your answers and arguments stick for like why the kind of like ability for the 1AC to exist in the terms that it does. Is it actually able to kind of like come to terms with what the alternative is attempting to solving for? And the link arguments I feel like are able to make a difference for you to start kind of switching yourself to like what impact comparison you need in order to win at the type of concerns that are taken up with this type of failure or refusal actually do in order to like produce something different, or are able to like at least resolve some of the impacts that you're spiking from the link arguments. I think in the context of impact comparison, a lot of the arguments that you want to pull is maybe arguments about like not necessarily why there's like some necessary body that is kind of like needed to be considered more than what the affirmative is really speaking to in the context of their criticism, but more so focusing on arguments about why the way in which they're thinking about being able to radically break away from those sources of violence and able to make that violence legible through their ability to insert things like impact calculus and the necessity of things like survival politics and etc. are all kind of modes of being able to like reinvent and saturate like the debate that you're kind of having at the link level about why the 1AC actually recreates and produces this form of violence and makes it necessary to the ability of us to be able to access radical features. I think there are a lot of really good arguments to make at the impact comparison level about why this kind of conception of how we're able to actually, how we compare bodies actually feeds into the exact link arguments that you're making, and only kind of like creates that form of like charity cannibalism and section of arguments that Baudrillard starts to make in the context of like how the kind of like victimization that kind of like justify these impacts only is what is kind of used as like main sources of consumption in order for various types of other privatized entities and structures of power to be able to use those things as necessary images for the continuation of things as is in the status quo, and ultimately makes those systems of violence worse, all of which I think are really interesting justifications for you to be able to make about why the particular framing that comes from these types of criticisms and how they kind of respond with just a different form of privatization doesn't actually produce anything other than that current form that we live in, this of the society that we live in, with less room to actually be able to radically break from things like the simulation or other kind of like modes of thinking about the world, because of the way in which it saturates us with this belief that we're doing something radically different by reinventing the wheel on kind of like what space exploration looks like. Hopefully this video has been helpful, and hopefully you'll tune into the next couple videos I'll be doing, ending this series out with how critical teams can respond to this like criticism, and hopefully you've enjoyed the series altogether. Thanks as always for tuning in.